Namaste, everybody.
Jai Shri Krishna.
Jai Shri Krishna. Thank you for joining us again. In the last episode, we covered up to verses 48. And at that point, Shri Krishna had started talking about the type of intellect or mind we have and the need for it to be a kind, calm, equanimous mind. You remember he referred to the Vedas, where he appears to be criticizing the Vedas, and we explained that he's not. And then he goes on to the type of actions we need to take, the type of mind we need to have. And that's what he's now going to focus on in the next few verses. So we finished verse 48, so we're going on to verse 49.
Durena hyavaram karma buddhiyogad dhananjaya buddhau sharanamanvichha kurupana phalahetavaha. Now Bhagavan says the first word is durena. Durena is from far away. He avaram karma. Avaram is inferior. Inferior action. So Bhagavan says that from far away, the inferior action, it is better than buddhi yoga. Bhagavan says that it should be done better way by intellect yoga. Then Bhagavan said, Buddhau sharanam anavichha. Buddha is again intellect, sharanam anavichha. This is surrender or refuge. Anavichha is seek or go to that yoga, which is intellect yoga. And Bhagavan says, Kurupanaha phalahetava. Phalahetava is the fruit of any action. Bhagavan says it is very pity to just seek for the fruit of any action. So now in these particular words, Bhagavan is referring more to buddhi yoga, which is the intellect.
So Shri Krishna says, seek refuge in an equanimous intellect and insight, Arjuna, and discard actions aimed at results that are certainly inferior to works performed with the intellect established in composure. Those who seek to work for the results are pitiable. That's pretty strong words. So let's go through what Bhagavan means again. First, he says, seek refuge in an equanimous intellect and insight. So it's interesting that when we have a problem, we get excited, we lose our nerve, we get angry, our mind starts to lose focus. But when we have a problem is precisely when we need to maintain our composure and our cool. And that's why Bhagavan is asking us to maintain equanimity of the mind. He will come in later chapters as to how we should do that and the techniques through which we can achieve that kind of composure. But for now, there are 2 MRI images which have been put out, which show very clearly the brain watching emotional content before meditation and then after a person has undergone 4 to 6 weeks of meditation practices and showing how their mind calms. And in the MRI images, one can actually see physically the difference between a mind with composure and a mind which has not yet learned to be composed. And this also shows something very interesting, that an equanimous intellect isn't something necessarily we're born with. It is something we acquire or we train our minds to be. And that's actually something that's very encouraging, which is that we don't look at somebody who's a very calm person and say, oh, well, they're lucky. I mean, they're just born that way. They probably weren't born that way. They probably acquired that capacity, or they may have acquired the capacity in a prior life. And when you look at the functional image of the brain where the person has never practiced meditation, you can see that an area of the brain lights up bright yellow and bright red to show the pain that they're suffering and the lack of composure. When the same person has gone through some weeks of meditation practice, you can see the amygdala, as it's called, is much less activated after the meditation training. So they handled whatever the emotional content was with composure. Then he says, discard actions aimed at results. Now, you remember in a prior verse, I think it was verse 48, we saw just how many variables there are that affect our life even up to the age of 9. Remember, it was 9 years, and there were 12,442 variables that affect our life just up to that age. So Bhagavan's now making a very, very practical point, which is, given that it's impossible to predict, even with the slightest accuracy, the outcome of any action, we should stop worrying about it and just carry out the action that we know we need to carry out with a calm mind. It also means that we will be able to think better what the correct action is. This is a problem. What do I need to do in this situation? If my brain is anxious, nervous, it's not going to be able to think through the options, and it's not going to be able to choose the correct option. So for that reason also, we should remain calm. Now, we also said in a prior verse that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't set goals for ourselves, but just that we shouldn't worry about each individual action. Then he says, inferior to works performed with the intellect established in composure. So when we take decisions in haste, or when we're agitated, we're obviously going to run the risk, a much bigger risk, of getting results that we really don't want, compared with decisions taken when we are composed and calm, which is another practical reason Bhagavan was giving that advice. There's a paper which is named How Neuroscience Can Help Us Make Better Decisions, and there was the following conclusion. He says the most successful people don't have super strong willpower when making decisions. Rather, they conserve their willpower by developing habits and routines, so they reduce the amount of stress in their lives. He says these people use their self-control or willpower not to get through crises, but to avoid them. So in other words, avoid reacting in a way that turns a minor problem into a crisis. They make important decisions early before fatigue sets in. And Steven Pinker, the world-renowned cognitive scientist at Harvard, says in an article in the New York Times, together with intelligence, self-control turns out to be the best predictor of a successful and satisfying life. So again, modern science validating everything that Bhagavan is asking us to do. Sri Krishna therefore asks us to work to achieve that composed mind, not try to predict results, avoid the type of actions that are inferior to ones taken with a composed mind. In other words, don't act in haste. Now, if given all these different studies and facts, the number of variables in our life, the fact that when we meditate, our mind becomes calmer and more able to accept adverse circumstances, then Bhagavan is right, isn't he, when he says we are clearly pitiable.
Yeah. Verse 50. Buddhiyukto jahatiha ubhe sukrutadushkrute tasmad yogaya yujyasva yoga karma sukausalam. Bhagavan says buddhiyukta. Buddhiyukta, which is equanimity mind, intellect. So usually equanimity actually represents the intellect which knows what is good and what is bad, but still it is equal. Because sometimes equanimity doesn't mean that you don't know. So it knows, in Sanskrit we call viveka buddhi. So that means it knows both what is good or what is bad. So Bhagavan says buddhi yuktaha, that equanimity mind or intellect, jahatiha, they get rid of ubhe. Ubhe means both. What is both? Sukruta, duskruta. Sukruta is good deeds and duskruta is bad deeds. Bhagavan said that equanimity mind leaves or get rid of those both, which is good deeds and bad deeds, and therefore tasmad Yogaya yujyasva. One say that for get united with yoga. Yoga means again the yoga what Bhagavan is talking about. Yoga, and then he used word which is very famous. This is very famous words, and it is used in so many governments also in India. They say yoga karma kaushalam. Yoga is that what Bhagavan has taught the equanimity of intellect. Karmasu kaushalam. Karmasu means in actions. Kaushalam means the art of expert. So it says the way you should do action like an expert. So that's why Bhagavan is using word yoga karmasu kaushalam.
Do you want to explain the word kaushalam?
Yeah.
Better coming from
Yeah,
you.
this
than
is
me.
beautiful. Yeah, it is very beautiful word kaushalam. So in Upanishads there are kaushalam words are there. In Sanskrit, kusha is like wooden sticks. So kushana word is kushan lati, means who brings that stick. So in the previous time, they say that for homam or for to cook anything, they used to bring. So Guru used to ask their students that go and get some wooden sticks. So when they bring wooden sticks to Guru, then Guru used to check their hands. And when Guru checks hands and he says that, okay, do you have any scar anywhere in your hand? If you have scars, that means you have not done work properly. If you have no scars, then Guruji used to say you are kushala. That means you are expert in that. So that is the meaning, and from there this word kushalam came. So it means that action should not be harmful to you. So the way you do action, that should not be harmful. Yeah. So that's how the expert words explains. Yeah.
You know, it's work expertly without damaging yourself.
Exactly.
But the verse says, one who prudently practices the science of work with his mind in equanimity can get rid of both good and bad reactions in this life itself. Therefore, strive for yoga, which is the art of working expertly in proper consciousness. So Bhagavan is giving a little twist to the meaning of the word yoga here. It means the ability to work expertly. You know, he again qualifies everything he says. We can now begin to see the stress he's going to lay throughout the Gita on the mind in equanimity. He says, without attachment to results. So again, he means carrying out the work without expecting a specific result. And we've seen how impossible it is to predict any result. So it's obviously wise to avoid constant stress and disappointment by going on worrying about results. Now he makes the interesting statement that we can get rid of good and bad reactions in this life itself. This doesn't mean that everything suddenly is going to go exactly the way we want and everything we like is going to happen. What he means by this is a person who works in this way without the expectation of specific results stops classifying and labeling events as good or bad and labeling outcomes. This is good, this is bad. This is because we may not immediately understand and we have no means of knowing whether the result is actually good or bad for us. And there's a great example of this told by Nick Nicholas, who was general manager at logistics. And this is what he says himself of what happened to him. He says, on 18 November 1987, I met a client in the West End of London who decided he was going to celebrate the fact that I and others had made him a load of money on the futures market. Says, I was only going to go out for a couple, but as the client got hammered, as the client got more and more drunk, one of us had to take him back to his hotel in Knightsbridge. I drew the short straw. In other words, he got that task of taking the client back. So he says, I got him back there, ordered some coffee, made him respectable, and delivered him back to his wife. Then he says, I went to the underground, the subway, to go home. And he found that it was mostly closed. Cursing my luck, I got a taxi home. Then I turned on the news. Had I gone my usual way home at the time we left the bar, I would have been at King's Cross changing trains right at the time a fire broke out there, killing 31 people. That is why Bhagavan says, don't keep trying to classify results as good and bad. And I'm sure we can relate to this incident that happened to this particular person, because there have been so many events I'm sure we ourselves know in our life where something that seemed adverse at the time happened, but it turned out to be entirely for our benefit. So he says, a person with equanimity, therefore, knowing that, accepts all outcomes, stops labeling them good or bad, and we simply extract what we should learn from each outcome. And so we use them as learning opportunities. Outcomes teach us. And then we saw in verse 49, the last verse, how being calm helps us to make better decisions. Literally, our brains change. So essentially, let's summarize. What is Bhagavan asking us to do? He says, be practical in your approach to work. Be mature. Understand that outcomes cannot be predicted given the large number of variables. Stop labeling outcomes good or bad and causing ourselves stress because everything we label as bad. Be mature enough to understand that an outcome that seems bad might actually be good and therefore have learning opportunities within that. Conversely, a result that we think is good may not necessarily be so. We remember from chapter 1 that Duryodhana wants outcomes constantly. He uses the word priya. I.e., I want outcomes that I like. But a much more mature Arjun uses the word shreya. He says they're good in the context of leading him to moksha. Therefore, he's eventual good, although he may not actually like the action, having to fight this war. So we need to understand that outcomes, they may not appear good to us in the context of we like this, but they may have important learning opportunities which we shouldn't miss. Therefore, they are shreya. And then he says, grow spiritually with all outcomes. Hence, Bhagavan asked Arjuna, each of us, to strive for that equanimity of mind, which he calls yoga. He said that is the very meaning of the word yoga, is that equanimity of mind. So let's go on now to verse 51.
Karmajam buddhi yukta hi phalam tyaktva manishinaha janma bandhav nirmuktah padam gacchantyanāmayam. Bhagavan says buddhi yukta means again equanimity mind or intellect person. Karmajam phalam tyaktva. So that now that person, Bhagavan is using the word here manishinaha. That means who is most intellectual person. Who lives, tyaktva means renouncing, karmajam phalam. Karmajam means the fruit which came from that action. So now Bhagavan says that equanimity mind person, intellect person, which is Bhagavan using manishi, they renounce those fruit of any action. And he says, janma bandha vinirmuktaha. Janma is again birth. So one says that birth and death, that cycle itself is bondage. So if one says they come out from that cycle or that janma, a birth cycle, and he says padam gacchanti anamayam. They reach that padam means that place which is place is not right. Padam which is that state of intellect. This is anamayam. Anamayam means there is no obstacles, or there is no the cycle which brings you back. So one says that person reaches that state of place where that person doesn't come back. So anamayam he is using. There is no obstacles.
So he says the intelligent, endowed with equanimity of mind, abandon attachment to the fruits of action, obtaining freedom from the cycle of life and death. By working in such consciousness, they attain the state beyond all obstacles. So again, we can see Bhagavan yet again repeating equanimity of the intellect. And this aspect is going to be critically important, and it is critically important to all of us throughout our lives. And we'll come in a later chapter to the number of adults who end up on tranquilizers like Valium, and I'm sure there are more modern ones than that. I don't know, I've never taken one, but I'm sure there are tons of them. And so they have health effects as well. We'll come to that. So in verse 49, remember we mentioned the fact that even MRI imaging shows the difference between a mind that has trained itself to be calm and a mind that hasn't undergone that training. So when Bhagavan uses the word endowed with equanimity, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was endowed at birth. It means that the intellect is now endowed with equanimity and calmness because the person has trained their brain to be that way. And he says such people are wise. He says if you're not born with a calm and controlled mind, well then seek to improve inborn tendencies and work towards it. Then he says stop seeking the results of action. So he's building on what he said in the last verse. Now a wise person will naturally do this, especially once they realize the huge number of variables that affect us. There's no point in continuously worrying about what the result of a particular action will be. But they also stop seeking the results of actions for a secondary reason. See, when a desire is satisfied, it doesn't end there. Generally, it gets replaced with another desire. So when we're students, we have a dorm, we take a job, maybe we have a one-bedroom condo, then maybe we get married, we get a promotion, then we want a 3-bedroom house with a lawn. Can we see how our needs continue to increase? Then we do better, we want a 4-bedroom house with a separate wing for guests maybe. So we see that a fulfillment of a desire doesn't end desire. It's like trying to extinguish fire by adding more ghee to it. It doesn't extinguish it. It causes the flames to rise higher, and desire is the same. So Bhagavan says the wise person gives it up knowing there can be no satisfying desires. They obtain freedom, he says, from the cycle of life and death. Now, it's logical that while we have desires, we will seek rebirths to fulfill our desires. And again, we'll come in a later chapter to numerous stories on reincarnation, and you'll judge for yourself whether you believe it, you think it's a hallucination, but we'll come to that. There is a reincarnation case that was very well researched by the University of Virginia, and it's that of Joe Leninger, a US fighter pilot who was killed in World War II. His fighter pilot ambitions were not fulfilled, and in the current life, he lives in Louisiana and says he reincarnated because he still had things he wanted to do. So there we are. Desire brought him back. So we should always be objective. So we should also note there are critics of the research done, in this case by the University of Virginia. And one example was at Michael Duth. And you can see it's called Leninger's Story Debunked. So by all means, have a look at that too. Now, it's because it's always important to look at both sides of a story. Important to understand that once Bhagavan starts dealing with non-material topics, it is very difficult for science in its current state to back him or back anything 100%. We can have evidence, but it's not scientific, what we would call scientific proof, and it's not possible to get at this stage. So when we're faced with situations like this where we can't get proof, we have to ask ourselves, when science backs up everything Bhagavan has said, which relates to the material universe and the material world as a whole, does Sri Krishna have any reason or motive to mislead us on non-material things? What would be his object in doing so? So then we can either accept what he says, saying that, well, I've proved 80% of everything you say. I'll have to accept the other 20% right now in the current state of science based on trusting you. If we think that he has some reason to mislead us, then obviously we would reject what he said. And this is a matter that each individual has to decide for themselves. Then he says, attain a state devoid of obstacles. Now, if the intelligent person is not working with any particular result in mind which they want, then obviously there are no obstacles. An obstacle comes in my way when I'm walking and I want to get from here to that tree, and suddenly I find there's a 3-foot wall. That's an obstacle because I want something specific. So by definition, an obstacle cannot exist if I'm not worried about the result of an action, because there's nothing to block my way or prevent or hinder progress. Since the person is not seeking any specific result or end, they don't view something as an obstacle. They view everything as a learning opportunity. Devoid of obstacles also denotes a frame of mind which doesn't seek to distinguish between, oh, this is a good result, oh, this is a bad result. It's only then that we have obstacles. So let's go on to verse 52.
Yada te moha kalilam buddhir vyatitarishati tadagantasi nirvedam srotavyasya srutasya cha. Bhagavan says yada, when it happens, te means yours, buddhihi means intellect, vyatitarishyati, it will go beyond. But from where, so it says moha kalilam. This is very interesting word which Bhagavan is using. First is moha, which is illusion, but moha is like what? Then Bhagavan says moha is like kalilam. Kalilam is quicksand. So this moha kalilam, which is illusion, is quicksand. Your intellect will go beyond this, the illusion of the quicksand illusion. Then Bhagavan says, if that happens, then tada gantasi nirvedam srotavyasya sutasya cha. He said, that time you will reach the state again, srotavyasya, which you have heard and which you are going to hear. You will reach that nirvedam. Nirvedam means, Ved again, it is knowledge or which we call Vedas, but nirvedam, which is beyond all knowledge and beyond everything. So then Bhagavan says, then your mind or intellect will cross the quicksand illusion, and you will reach or attain to that beyond that Vedas or beyond that knowledge.
Yeah. So Sri Krishna now says, when your intellect crosses the quicksand of illusion, you will then acquire proper knowledge as to what has been heard and what is yet to be heard about enjoyments in this world and the next. So Bhagavan now uses the word illusion. And this word basically means that there is a misperception resulting from a trick of the senses. And in further chapters, we will actually come to how our senses do deceive us. They're not made to present reality to us, and we'll see why again in later chapters. They continuously present things to us as they appear, not as they actually are. So another definition of illusion is a thing that is or is likely to be wrongfully perceived or interpreted by the senses. So in both cases, what it says is our senses are not interpreting what they actually see here correctly. They're misconstruing reality. Now, Bhagavan calls this quicksand, in which we are trapped. A quicksand is actually a combination of fine sand, clay, and salt water. It's an interesting comparison that he's making, because the more you try to move in it and free yourself, the deeper we sink into the quicksand. It's the quality of quicksand. So similarly, he's saying, the higher the stress on the quicksand, the more fluid it becomes. This causes a trapped body to sink when it starts to move. It goes deeper and deeper in. Essentially, one sinks to one's waist and stays there trapped. Now, we will see how appropriate Bhagavan's comparison is, because that's exactly what illusion does to us. Now, the traditional explanation of the verse is Bhagavan is saying we're under the illusion that the things of the senses will give us happiness. The illusion is incorrect, therefore we should not pursue the material world. But actually Bhagavan, as usual, is saying far more than that. He's referring to when our intellect will cross or overcome, he says, the quicksand of illusion. When that happens, he says, we will become indifferent to the matters of the senses. So we'll become indifferent to what our senses are telling us. Remember chapter 2, this chapter, verse 13, we understood the two-slit experiment. What is actually an energy wave is interpreted by our senses as different particles with different properties, even though the energy pattern made by all of them is identical, no difference. But science today is saying much more than that. In 2017, in Physical Review Letters of the American Physical Society, published research by physicists at the University of Waterloo, University of Salento in Italy, Institute of Nuclear Physics in Italy, a University of Southampton researcher who was a winner of a W.B. Pearson Medal in Physics and Astronomy, Southampton Theory of Astrophysics and Gravity, a very illustrious set of physicists anyway. Now, the researchers believe, fascinatingly, that they found evidence that our entire universe is an illusion. They postulate that the entire universe is a hologram. This means that information that makes up what we perceive as 3D reality is stored on a 2D surface, including time. This means essentially everything we see and experience is an illusion. So Bhagwan's use of the word illusion was very apt. Now there's another professor, Kostas Skenderis, University of Southampton, explains it actually very nicely in layman's terms. So let me read to you what he says. Imagine that everything you see, feel, hear in 3 dimensions and your perception of time in fact emanates from a flat 2-dimensional field. And he says the idea is similar to that of ordinary holograms, where a 3D image is encoded in a 2D surface, such as a hologram on a credit card. However, this time, the entire universe is encoded. So think of a 3D movie. These films create the illusion of 3D objects from a flat 2D screen. So there is a full physics paper on it, which may prove a little bit complex. And it's called From Planck Data to Planck Era, Observational Tests of Holographic Cosmology. But I've tried to explain it in brief what it means. That physicists are now saying, what Bhagwan said centuries ago, try to overcome illusions, that is, well, the entire universe is an illusion. Researchers at the University of Bristol, for example, now have even managed to make a hologram which you can touch and even feels real. This has significant implications, not just for what we're discussing here and for playing games, but it has very real implications, for example, for surgeons. A surgeon able to project and feel a tumor and its margins before actually carrying out surgery. Now, we have to remember at all times that nothing exists other than a wave of energy, which our senses show as a solid object that we can even touch and feel. And University of Bristol has actually done that. So, 5,000 years ago, 5,100 years ago, what does Bhagwan ask us to do? He says, cross this quicksand of illusion. Because the property of quicksand is that if you don't get over the illusion, it drags you deeper and deeper into itself. So he says, instead of dragging yourself deeper and deeper into this illusion of the world, of your senses, try to overcome it instead. And recognize the only thing that actually is real, says, which is the Paramatma. So his example of quicksand, he's warning that if you don't do that, you are going to get trapped exactly in the way a person or an animal gets trapped in quicksand. Now, to understand 2D surface, we'd have to go into something called string theory. So let's not go there. Let's just leave it at that there's a 2D surface on which things are encoded. But very fascinatingly, science is saying exactly what he said 5,100 years ago. And he's asking us not to allow ourselves to get trapped. So verse 53.
Yeah. Shruti vipratipannate yada sthashyati nischala samadhavachala buddhis tada yogam avapsyasi. Now one says Shruti vipratipanna. So he is using the adjective of word intellect. He says that how should be the intellect? He said, intellect ceases to be doubtful. So Shruti, which is again Vipratipanna, so Shruti again here, Bhagavan is trying to say that which is according to Vedas or knowledge. Yada sthasyati nischala. Yada means when. Sthasyati means stays. Nischala means immovable. Samadho achala buddhi. Bhagavan says how should be the intellect? He says samadhi. Samadhi is again the extreme or great meditation. Achala buddhi. Achala buddhi means, so Bhagavan is again here using one word is nischala buddhi and second is achala buddhi. So achala, which is again, Bhagavan is saying, which is so strongly steady, which is not or which is impossible to move, then yogam avapsasi, that kind of intellect can reach or unite with yogam, with yoga.
So he says in verse 53, when your intellect ceases to be assailed by doubt and remains active but steady in the knowledge of the self, the Atma, you will then attain the state of perfect yoga, which in this context means perfect composure. So once we actually understand that not only are pleasures derived from our senses, which are not presenting reality to us, and are presenting things to us that are temporary and illusory, once we understand that the entire universe is also illusory and is shifting like quicksand, remember last verse, then he says the person's intellect will gradually be less and less attracted to the sensations given by the senses. Now, as we become less attracted to the pleasures and other senses, feedback, we're also going to become much less interested in achieving such pleasures, because we know that they're false. We'll also cease to doubt, since we will fully understand the nature of matter, the universe, and ourself. What is the nature of ourself compared to the nature of matter and the universe? Now, Robert Lanza is an American medical doctor and scientist. Currently, he's the head of Astellas Global Regenerative Medicine, Chief Scientific Officer of the Astellas Institute for Regenerative Medicine. He's an adjunct professor at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. Now, Robert Bowman, known as Bob Bowman, he's an American astronomer, writer, science popularizer. He runs Overlook Observatory in Woodstock, New York. So let's see what they say. They explain in an article the theory of what they call biocentrism, that the universe did not create us. We created the universe. Astonishing concept, but one which science bears out more and more and more. And actually the two-slit experiment gave us that clue, that until there was an observer, there was nothing. There were just energy waves, packets of energy. Only when the observer was there did we actually see a particle. So it's saying it's life and consciousness that makes our universe what it is. It's we who make the universe what it is. It's not the other way around. But let me quote from the actual article so that I'm not putting words into the mouths of scientists, but let's evaluate their own words. First, they say, science has not confronted the one thing that is at once most familiar and most mysterious: consciousness. What exactly is consciousness? Why are we conscious? Then he says consciousness is not just an issue for biologists. It's a problem of physics. There is nothing in modern physics that explains how a group of molecules in a brain creates consciousness. So I have a brain, it's something physical, it's sitting inside there. It has neurons and things fly between each other, sending messages. But how do we get consciousness out of there? Nobody's been able to explain that. What does that mean? It says the beauty of a sunset. So, okay, we see a sunset, the sun has set. What gives us the experience, the consciousness that it's something beautiful? The taste of a delicious meal. These are all mysteries to science. We don't know. And sometimes we can pin down where in the brain sensations occur. So they'll say that you're in such and such a part of your brain, emotions are stored. Such and such a part of the brain records pain and records pleasure. But how and why is there any subjective, personal experience to begin with? What's worse, nothing in science can explain how consciousness arose from matter. Our understanding of this most basic phenomenon is virtually nil. Interestingly, most models of physics do not even recognize this as a problem yet. Then they go on to say, why are the laws of physics exactly balanced for animal life to exist? This is still the two scientists speaking. There are over 200 physical parameters within the solar system and universe, so exact that it strains credulity to propose that they are random. It defies belief that they're all just random and all happen together. And the chances of them all happening together are infinitesimally small. But let's continue with what they're saying. Even if that is exactly what standard contemporary physics baldly suggests, these fundamental constants of the universe, constants that are not predicted by any theory, all seem to be carefully chosen, often with great precision, to allow for the existence of life and consciousness. Yes, consciousness raises its annoying head yet another time. We have absolutely no reasonable explanation for this. Then they continue. Starting in the 1920s, the results of experiments have shown that the observer critically influences the outcome. They're referring to the two-slit experiment, which took place in the 1920s. An electron turns out to be both a particle and a wave. But how? And more importantly, where such a particle will be located, where will be it located in the future, remains dependent upon the very act of observation. So you don't know where the particle will end up without the act of observation. Then they say language and customs say it, the universe, your kitchen, even, all lies outside us in the external world. So the kitchen, the camera, it's outside of me, it's saying. I'm here, the camera is over there. Yet we're already seeing that nothing can be perceived that is not already interacting with our consciousness. If it doesn't interact with your consciousness, you won't know it's there. Yet another thing that science cannot explain. They say some may imagine that there are two worlds, one out there and a separate one inside the skull. But the two worlds model is a myth, as we have seen only one visual reality is extant. It is the one that requires consciousness in order to manifest. Without consciousness, they're saying, the universe cannot even manifest to us. As Nobel physicist John Wheeler once said, no phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. In other words, it doesn't exist until it's observed. So Bhagavan told us thousands of years ago, the only reality is our consciousness, the Atma. Once we understand that and are completely established in that samadhi, we will attain, he says, the perfect state of yoga. We'll reach a perfect understanding. Now, Bhagavan will come back to the fact repeatedly throughout the Gita that the only reality, the only thing that exists is our consciousness. Or, as he will say in later chapters, Brahman, that infinite existence consciousness in which we all exist and have our being. Now, it's obvious, I think, at this point, we will cease to work with the desire for a particular outcome, fully understanding yet another fact that an outcome cannot be predicted. There's a difference between examining facts to prove that the earth is flat. Yeah? So we examine the facts and say, oh, yeah, the earth is flat. And seeking facts to establish what shape is the earth. So in other words, you can approach something with a preconceived notion. The earth is flat. I'm going to collect all the information and facts that prove the earth is flat. That's not a scientific approach. And it's not the approach Bhagavan is asking us to take. Collect all the facts that you can and then determine, is the earth flat? Is it round? Is it elliptical? What is it? But first gather the facts. And he asks us to do that again in the Gita. no scientist ever sets out to prove a particular theory. Rather, he fits the theory around facts. And that's what Bhagavan is asking us to do in this as well. So he says, what actions are called for from us, but don't set out an end agenda? That's what a scientist does. No, I don't have an end agenda to prove that the earth is a square. I'm just going to look at the facts and then decide what it is. And Bhagavan says, well, do exactly that. So he says, only by working in this way will we achieve the equanimity of mind that he calls yoga. Mind of such a person is now very steady and cannot be made unsteady. Therefore, he uses the word achal, which refers to something that by its very nature is steady. And we will come to the Sanskrit of achal and nishchal in a later verse, very interesting verse about oceans. Yeah?
Right.
But right now, we will leave it for now. But we thank you for listening. And we hope that before the next video, you will have been working hard to achieve an equanimous mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.